Right. So we've had two discussions so far. The first one, we had a sort of a general overview of Stoicism. And the second one, we had a deep dive into the life of Marcus Aurelius. And we talked about your book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. But now I'm excited to talk to you about your latest project. I was wondering if you tell us more about that.
Well, the book that I've got coming out is called Verissimus, and it's a graphic novel about the life and philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. So it's kind of my latest project, although the weird thing about publishing is I finished that book a while ago. So, and I've written another book since then.
Wow.
And started a third book. So everything's usually seems a little bit out of sync when books come out. But Verissimus is coming out very soon, on the 12th of July. And we were working on it for longer than a normal book. Usually a book takes about a year, roughly. That's kind of what's assumed in the publishing industry. But this took maybe 2 or 3 years altogether. Graphic novels can sometimes take longer, especially mainly because the artwork, the script for it, took about 6 months to write. But because it's quite a big book, it's about 230 or 40 pages. It's full color, 9-panel pages. So there's a lot of artwork. And we could have done a graphic novel that was just a bunch of matchstick men talking about, which now seems kind of like an appealing idea in retrospect. But we decided we were going to make it more cinematic, and we put a lot of time and effort into designing the panels, like you would design a shot in cinema. And, we spent a lot of time verifying historical details. So verifying details about the philosophy, which is kind of my area, and to some extent in history. But we had consultants that we worked with to verify, like, Roman legionaries' belt buckles and the length of their swords. Was a bone of contention, right? Actually, because our consultant, the first thing he told us was all the swords were the wrong length in all the initial draft. They had a gladius, and he said, around about this period in history, Roman legionaries started to use the spatha, which is a slightly longer sword. It's better for fighting cavalry. And we're like, we have to go through all of the pictures and make the swords like an inch longer. So we did a lot of that kind of stuff in verifying the furniture. The landscapes, we did Zeno Fragas, my illustrator. He's Portuguese, and he drew Carnuntum with hills and stuff. And actually, I went to Carnuntum in Austria for a week to shoot video and interview the head of archaeological research there and the head of the museums. And one of the first things they told us was they said, Carnuntum, the landscape here's flat, right? There aren't any mountains. So we kind of had to do a lot of things like changing the landscape and stuff. And then verifying the language used as well was kind of an interesting one. So when people, the way, sort of colloquial language we wanted to get accurate. Yeah. So when people, if someone swears an oath, or if they're addressing another person, how would they phrase it? We talk a little bit about that in the back of the book. So actually the sources that we have for that are Marcus's private letters. And that gives us a kind of indication of how he actually spoke in private, which is very different from how he wrote the Meditations. And so a lot of it might surprise people. So for instance, he tends to refer with a lot of affection towards his teachers. He calls Fronto, his rhetoric teacher, best of masters, is how he often addresses him. And his mother is addressed by Fronto just as the mother of Caesar in private. That's what he calls her. To the mother of Caesar is how he addresses his letters. So we kind of studied all these little details, and we tried to get the language accurate. Took 2 or 3 years to finish the whole thing. And it cured my perfectionism, because I realized it's completely impossible to do, unless you've got a time machine, to have a completely historically accurate 2nd century Roman graphic novel. But we tried our best to get as close as we could. And like I said, I right in the outset, when we first proposed it, I said, I don't want a bunch of guys in togas doing what I would call a dialogue dump. So it would be easy. I think some graphic novels are written where the script is just like he said this and he said that, and then the artist just kind of draws guys talking or whatever, and like there's not a lot of description of action. Our script goes into a lot of detail, describing the visual landscape and the action that's taking place. And whenever there's philosophy, we always tried to tie it into the action, and we used tricks of the trade even to kind of push that further. So, for example, in situations where we've got people talking about stuff that doesn't relate to action, what we do is have parallel scenes unfolding visually. I'll give you an example. So, like, Marcus is talking like about something that isn't directly related to action. So rather than just having him kind of walking along the street or in his palace, we set it at the Circus Maximus, and there's a chariot race going on in the background. So we imagine he's having this conversation while he's simultaneously watching a chariot race, and then that allows us to have kind of like a chariot crashing and action unfolding that kind of symbolically parallels the stuff that's happening in the conversation. Otherwise, we just have like two talking heads, like in a boring background, right? So we use these tricks of the trade to try and keep the visual, keep the action going, and make full use of the visual medium.
Yeah, wow. I didn't, for some reason, I didn't even think about the fact that it had to be accurate historically. You know, that's like a whole other dimension to the project, right? Like,
I guess it didn't have to be, but we just decided that we were going to try. And, you know, so I went to the stuff in it that there's like, I guess, Easter eggs in it, or the stuff in it, in that book, that probably nobody except me would notice. But like, for example, we'll depict, Marcus has a dream about the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, like, and, you know, like, even I sent Zé photographs of the rocks that are actually there. Like, so there's the shape of the rocks matches like the actual landscape at Delphi. Wow. So I went to these locations and researched them, and the museums as well. You know, like I say, we were interested in what Carnuntum really looked like, and, you know, little details about what Marcus would have been doing there and what we would have seen. And we spent a lot of research too. One of the hardest things actually was researching the so-called barbarian races, because we don't have as much evidence about them, and the Romans, when they describe what they call barbarians, kind of almost caricature them to some extent, and they'll be like, yeah, those guys all just dress in furs and grunt a lot, and they all drink a lot of wine, and they just throw axes at people, and they're like, you know, like cavemen or something like that. But that's kind of come down to it. Like, that's how we see Germanic tribesmen when they're kind of depicted in movies and stuff like that, because that's how the Romans describe them. But the Romans are also just caricaturing them because they want to make them out to be primitive. Right. So we kind of got to strike a balance between, to some extent, taking what the Romans say seriously because they were actually there and they saw them, but at the same time trying to kind of see through some of the propaganda and imagining a little bit more what these guys would actually look like. And I'm trying to kind of make them a little bit more visually interesting. That movie, The Northman, these things fascinate me. I spent so much time watching movies. I started reading graphic novels to research this, and then I abandoned that pretty early on because I found that I was getting a lot more inspiration from movies and like TV series about like sword and sandal stuff. So I watched and rewatched so many things shot by shot, like looking for things that we could incorporate into the graphic novel. And it fascinates me now because, like, with the Northman, I think if you're going to portray Vikings or like the Germanic tribes, your problem is it gets quite visually monotonous. It's like a bunch of guys with beards and axes and mud huts or wooden huts and kind of like muddy forests and stuff like that. Like, and so after like about an hour, like it's kind of like we need to spice this up a little bit because it's not as interesting visually as, you know, Thor Ragnarok or something like that, where it's like colourful. There's loads more going on. So in the graphic novel, we thought about that, and we tried to make sure we changed location, that we made an effort to kind of vary the appearance more of like the things that were going on in certain scenes, so we're not just kind of like depicting the same cliched stuff over and over. So I think we crammed quite a lot into it. That's why it took 3 times as long as normal, but
So yeah, I mean, one of the things I really love about the books that you've written. So if we just take How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the experience of reading that is felt very like easy, like enjoyable. Like you could just go from chapter to chapter, and you felt like you were learning. But there was also this, like, you could tell there was a lot of detail, but the detail wasn't kind of confusing or boring. You know, like you were reading like a history textbook, but it was there. So that's one thing. So I can see why you would have been like really interested to get the details right for the graphic novel.
I'm wondering it starts off confusing and boring, and then there's a lot of editing involved to make it not less confusing and boring.
Right. I'm wondering what the sort of the mission or the intention was behind this project, because you're doing multiple things with it. You're educating people, you're entertaining people. You're also, giving people prompts towards living a more meaningful, wise life, right? There's a lot that's packed into this project. So what was the thing that kind of motivated you to do this? Because I don't see people doing this often.
To do a graphic novel specifically.
Yeah.
There's really kind of like a bunch of things that led towards it happening. I noticed that because people have asked me this question before, and I think I've given different answers to the question, because there were kind of like, there were different reasons why we wound up doing this. And some of it was chance, and some of it was design. And so in part, it's like, one answer is that I've been writing about Stoicism for like, since before it was cool. Like, people say I was into this band before they were cool. Like, when I first started researching Stoicism, literally everyone told me it was this obscure thing that no one was interested in, and like, why are you wasting your time on it and stuff like that? Because it wasn't that long. It was like about 25 years ago, but there were very few books on it, and it was considered a real niche subject. And then suddenly it exploded and became really popular, and Ryan Holiday's books came out, and Massimo Pollucci's books came out, and suddenly everyone was talking about Stoicism. But it wasn't like that a while back. And so I'd already written books about Stoicism and talked about Stoicism, and publishers were like, could you like write an introduction to Stoicism? And I was like, I've already written one. That's the problem. Like, I feel like I've written several, so I can't just keep writing the same book, much as I'd love to. It gets a bit repetitive after a while. So I thought, how can I do an introduction to Stoicism that's different? And that was how I came to write How to Think Roman Emperor. Like, I thought I'll make it more about the character of one of the main historical figures. And then, I thought, well, we could write a book about Stoicism that's kind of designed as an introduction for people. That's what everybody always wants. Like, how do we get into this subject? But why not make it a graphic novel? And then it's a completely different medium. Like, it's not just like yet another kind of basic Idiot's Guide to Stoicism or whatever, but like a whole different way of introducing people to the subject. And also, I know there are people who want to get into the subject who maybe don't really read philosophy or self-help books. I realized that weirdly, in part through working with the military. Like, I've done a lot of stuff with the military over the past few years. I went to Quantico and spoke to the US Marine Corps University. I gave a workshop for Fort Leonard Wood, the officers there. We ran a conference for the military. And it was partly through conversations with those guys. They were saying, like some of the guys in the Marines weren't really into reading self-help books in history, but they kind of like Gladiator and 300, and they kind of like the idea of Stoicism. And movies and graphic novels and stuff are like more valuable in terms of reaching like people. Like, when you read books about self-help, you kind of assume that everyone else reads this stuff, but a lot of people aren't really into wading through classics, but they might benefit a lot from the ideas. So we wanted to do something that was going to reach a different audience. And it's funny because people keep saying to me, they want to buy a copy for their kids. And I'm like, well, it's kind of PG. Like, there's nudity, torture, like there's a lot of death, and guys talking about coming to terms with their own mortality in a graveyard and things like that. And supernatural horror even, like, so I'm like, I don't know if I'd give it to little kids. Like, it's not like, Harry Potter or whatever. It's kind of dark, I guess. But I think it will reach a young, maybe teenagers, or, like a slightly different age group. Like, although it does surprise me how many people assume that because it's a comic, it must be for little kids or something. No, It's meant for adults, but probably it would reach a slightly different group of adults.
Well, thinking about it now, I mean, I know there's a lot of talk about like how do you teach young children Stoicism and things like that, but I mean, the people who probably need Stoicism the most are teenagers, you know, because they go through this intense shift, like physiologically, right? And like even if they've had like a really stable childhood, now things are different and there's a lot of choices being made. So yeah, damn, if I could have read something like this when I was 13, 14, 15, you know, could have made a big difference.
I would have read this when I was a teenager. I would have thought it was awesome. So maybe I think often when you're an author, you can't just write stuff that's entirely for yourself. Like, you know, you've got editors and things like that, but like there's a balancing act to be done. But to some extent, you know, you're writing things that you think are cool and that you would have read, like if you were in that position. I remember, like, one of the things at the back of my mind was when the movie Gladiator came out, which is a long time ago now. It's like 20 odd years ago now.
Wow.
A lot of people got into Stoicism because Richard Harris plays Marcus Aurelius in the first act. And I knew guys that said they didn't read philosophy, but after they watched that movie, they went and looked up Marcus Aurelius on Wikipedia or whatever, and they stumbled across the Meditations, and then they kind of got into it. And I always thought, I kind of wish there was more Stoicism in Gladiator. Like, there's kind of one or two fleeting references to it, more than most people probably realise, actually, because apparently Russell Crowe's really into Meditations, and he kind of wanted there to be more references to it, but there ended up just being like one or two kind of fleeting ones. So at the back of my mind, I was always thinking, wouldn't it be cool if there was just like a bit more Stoicism mentioned in Gladiator? This was, I guess, my chance unconsciously. I didn't realize until we were towards the end of doing this. I thought, I guess in a sense this is like a prequel to Gladiator. Like, kind of ends round about where the movie Gladiator begins. But this graphic novel has way more Stoic philosophy in it, I think, than people would expect. It's got both. Like, I guess people would expect it to maybe just be like an action thing, or they'd expect a lot of philosophy but not much action. But really, it's got a lot of both crammed into it, which took a lot more work than you would perhaps assume at first. We spent ages like trying to figure out ways to weave the philosophy into the action. That was one of the biggest challenges that we set for ourselves.
How did you manage to kind of find the balance between sort of drama, you know, and kind of like giving people like a story that kind of, you know, you might need to kind of be a bit flexible with the historical stuff versus like giving people just like a completely accurate step-by-step kind of like, this is how events unfolded? Or did you kind of do both at the same time? Like, how did you manage that?
I know that this is going to surprise people, but the version of Marcus's life that we tell in that graphic novel is basically pretty faithful to what comes down to us in the Roman histories. Now, that said, obviously, I would take it for granted that the Roman histories aren't completely reliable, right? So our main source, the Historia Augusta, is kind of notoriously unreliable. And it's to some extent a sort of literary work anyway. It's no coincidence. And in fact, it does us a favour. I guess this is also something that's going on in the background here, that we have three main sources for Marcus Aurelius' life in terms of Roman histories: Cassius Dio, the Historia Augusta, and Herodian. The Historia Augusta is the main one. The Historia Augusta portrays the other people surrounding Marcus as kind of grotesque, caricature figures, right? Maybe broadly historically accurate. It's generally believed that they kind of turned the dial up to 11 a bit. So, for example, the way it portrays Commodus is kind of monstrous, and maybe he probably was pretty bad, but it comes across like there's a bit of sensationalism going on in our sources for literary effect. But that also kind of works in our favour in terms of dramatising the story and making it into something like a graphic novel. So it's surprisingly easy. One thing that's really striking is that when we read the Meditations, and there are reasons for this, but when we read the Meditations, we kind of imagine Marcus in a room on his own by lamplight, you know, kind of writing down these musings. We don't kind of envisage that he's surrounded by this complete kind of clown show of like crazy people that he was, it's like he's got this ensemble cast of strange people that that are very colorful, very different from one another. And that doesn't come across in the meditation, but that defines who he is. Like, you understand someone when you see their family and friends and the people that they spend time with. We don't get that from the meditations. Although in book 1, he talks about them, it doesn't really kind of allow us to visualize what they were like. The Roman history is painting this picture of them as being a really varied, really colorful bunch of people. And that casts Marcus in a completely different light. As soon as it's like a jigsaw piece. And when we slot him into the middle of the jigsaw puzzle, suddenly all the stuff he's saying in the meditations starts to kind of take on a slightly different meaning. So first of all, on the one hand, we're pretty faithful to the historical sources and not just like what it says there, but also archaeological evidence, stuff that we know of from broader research about the period in history, about Roman culture in general, like a whole wealth of sources that we have to draw on, really, like inscriptions and numismatic evidence, like coins and stuff, like intense, like a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But even really obscure sources that we have to look at to try and piece together Marcus Aurelius's life. But with all this evidence, there's gaps in it, there's contradictions in it, there's stuff in it that looks like it's probably not reliable. So this is the mess that historians have to sift through. Right. And you have to make a decision about if the histories say something. In an academic history, you would say, okay, the Historia Augusta says this, but we're not really sure we believe it. Or the Historia Augusta says this, but Cassius Dio says something slightly different. And then in a boring academic history, you can kind of qualify everything. In a graphic novel or a movie, you have to pick an interpretation. And stick with it. Now, there is one way around that, which is that where there's gossip reported. So one of the weird things is that Roman histories often report gossip, and they'll tell us it's gossip or propaganda or whatever. And then in a graphic novel or a movie, you think, well, what can we do with this? Because it seems like it's probably not true, but it's kind of interesting and it's a colourful story. But what we figured out is that we can include stuff like that as long as we actually portray it as gossip. So there's scenes where we just have people gossiping about Marcus and Faustina, for example. And actually it's quite liberating because then you can go, okay, we get it now. Like that tells us something about Marcus, that people would be saying these things about him. Like that's part of who he is the fact that like the Roman people are think that his wife is sleeping with gladiators and this is the talk of the town and people are mocking him for that and stuff. And we can leave it up to the reader to say, like, who knows whether this is actually true or not. But what we do know is that people were saying this. Like, so this is the environment in which he's living. And actually, that's more interesting in a way because it becomes pretty obvious. Like, why would people say this stuff? A really obvious explanation is almost all the gossip about Marcus Aurelius casts doubt on the legitimacy of Commodus. So Faustina's sleeping with gladiators, right? That means Commodus isn't Marcus's real son, is what they're insinuating. Why would they do that? Like, because they want to cast doubt on the succession. Who would do that? Like, well, usurpers, like rivals to the throne, like Avidius Cassius. There was a civil war. So it's no surprise that during the Civil War, people would say, that guy Commodus isn't even his real son. It's political propaganda. It makes perfect sense in terms of the conflict that's going on at the time. So we remained faithful to the sources, but you'd have to qualify that by saying the sources contain stuff like that we know is maybe fictionalized or it's not completely reliable. But nevertheless, you probably far more than readers would assume if they go and read the Historia Augusta and they kind of read modern biographies and they dig into the kind of more obscure bits of it, they'll see that a lot of research has gone into this book. The book I wrote after it is a conventional prose biography of Marcus Aurelius for Yale University Press. So that has to be written to more of an academic standard. Like in that book, I guess it would be a good companion piece for some people, because they'll see in the biography that most of the stuff that we're saying in the graphic novel is based on historical research. It's not made up. There are things that there's one or two things that we had to kind of bite our lip and go, we're going to have to change this because it doesn't work otherwise as a story. There's gaps in the story where we're going to have to kind of either just, seldom did we ever just make stuff up. Like usually where we bit our lip and kind of had to kind of force something a little bit, it was where there was like a kind of ambiguity or a kind of tenuous evidence. And we had to kind of, so I'll give you an example. We don't really know how Marcus won the Civil War. The guy, one of his most senior general in the East, instigated a civil war and had himself declared a rival emperor. And then after a few months, he was assassinated by his own officers. So at one level, that's the story. It's kind of interesting. But for a graphic novel, you're going to be like, well, hang on a minute. Why was he assassinated by his own officers? Like, why did they suddenly change their mind and back out of this? So there's kind of like holes in the story. And there's a kind of slightly more complicated explanation I give about the military strategy and why I think they ended up in this situation. But part of it is I believe that Marcus sent a huge contingent of tens of thousands of cavalry, like shock troops ahead. Like, because his problem was it would have taken Marcus a really long time to move his army from the northern frontier to the east, where this rival emperor was based. And we don't know that he did that. The only evidence that we have that he sent a huge cavalry force there is in basically one inscription. And a bit of in a reference in the Historia Augusta that says something similar but slightly different. So we've got these two kind of little bits of evidence. So there we have to go, okay, this story doesn't really make sense unless we say we're based on these two fragments of evidence. We think probably what happened here to join the dots is it sounds like he took a huge barbarian auxiliary force and sent them like racing ahead to intervene. And then the enemy were caught off guard by that and thought, that's it, we've lost. Like, because we've lost our advantage now. And so the officers executed their general. Spoiler alert, by the way. Spoiler alerts about ancient Roman stuff that happened like 2,000 years ago. So anyway, there's places where we had to kind of, maybe I say things that if I was writing a prose history, I'd qualify a bit more, and I'd present more tentatively. But I guess once you explain that, some people will read this and assume it's all made up. People read How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and some of the reviewers were like, this is just a load of stories you've made up about Marcus Aurelius. Wow. And that surprised me. And at first I thought, I don't understand why they think this is all made up. And then I realized why. It's because the people that wrote that in reviews or thought that were all listening to the audiobook. And when you listen to the audiobook, one thing that's missing from it is the footnotes. So they didn't know that all of the references is a historical event. There's like over 100 references, and even in How to Think of the Roman Emperor, and that's a self-help book, to the historical sources. Like, so no, we're just like retelling the stuff that Cassius Dio says happened, like, and that other historians have reported. But a lot of people don't know anything about Marcus Aurelius, so they think. I mean, this is really weird, but people believe strange things on the internet, right? So there are a lot of people, I meet people still who are like, oh, we don't know anything about Marcus Aurelius. We know more about Marcus Aurelius than we do about possibly any other ancient philosopher. We definitely know way more about him than we do about any other Stoic philosopher, because he was a big deal. Like, he was a Roman emperor, so we have loads of stuff. We don't even know for sure, like, we've no idea what Epictetus looks like, right?
Yeah.
The other famous Stoics. There aren't any statues of him. There are loads of statues of Marcus Aurelius as a child, as an old man, because he was a big deal. And historians recorded, we have a record of his legal rescripts. We know the legislation that he passed. We have his private letters. We've got references to him in loads of other sources, little fragments here and there. And also because the other interesting thing about Marcus is because he's a big deal, he's associated with other famous figures, right? So one of our best sources for understanding Marcus Aurelius is information about his predecessors. So particularly Hadrian, which people often don't mention. We know a lot, of course we know a lot about Hadrian, because Hadrian was also a big deal. And so there's sculptures, inscriptions, records, we know quite a lot about Hadrian. But Marcus knew Hadrian. Marcus lived in Hadrian's house, for the last 6 months or so of Hadrian's life. Hadrian chose Marcus to be his successor after Antoninus Pius. So by studying more about Hadrian and thinking about how their lives overlap and intersect, that allows us to also add more context to our understanding of Marcus Aurelius. Hadrian was his adoptive grandfather. So, this is the house that, we can go to the ruins of Hadrian's villa. Marcus lived there. So sometimes we have to look at these other famous figures, and they provide more pieces of the jigsaw, as it were, that allow us to know more about Marcus. But if people are in any doubt, they could just read the prose biography that I've written as well, and they'll see where all of this information comes from, essentially.
Is that out?
A lot out there.
The prose bio
it won't be out till next year. So these things are kind of a bit, publishing always feels a little bit out of sync. So I finished that book, and I'm now writing another book. But that won't be that probably won't be published until spring 2023. But there are many the other weird thing is when people say they don't think we know anything about Marcus Aurelius, there are more biographies already of Marcus Aurelius than of, I don't know, any other ancient philosopher, I guess. There's loads of biographies of Marcus Aurelius. Frank McLynn's is the most famous one. Anthony Burley's is the best one. We even have we've got a 17th century biography of Marcus Aurelius. There's loads of them, weirdly, but it's strange that people don't know all this stuff exists.
Yeah. I was going to say that, have you ever read a biography of Marcus Aurelius and you, on one hand, feel like it's historical and the person has done their research, but they don't really get Stoicism?
Yeah.
Because there's that's a whole other universe as well, right? So
pretty much all of them.
Okay.
I don't know whether it's just something about being a historian. They all seem to have contempt for philosophy or something. Frank McLynn's is the worst in that regard. He just says that he thinks Stoicism is a stupid philosophy, and he doesn't get it at all. I wrote in my biography, the first thing I say is writing a biography of I quote Frank McLynn at the beginning, and he says, "This is ridiculous philosophy," blah, blah. And I say, "This is a caricature of Stoicism, right?" And right in the introduction, I say, writing a biography of Marcus Aurelius and dismissing Stoicism would be like writing a biography of St. Augustine and ignoring the role of Christianity in his life. It doesn't make any sense. Everything that Marcus Aurelius did was influenced by his belief in Stoicism. It was like a religion to him. It was his philosophy of life. And you absolutely have to understand Stoicism in order to understand who he was and why he did the things he did. And also the people he was interacting with, his most senior advisors were Stoics as well, some of them. So it's absurd, to caricature the philosophy in a biography. But I can't really, I think all of them dismiss the philosophy. So one of the things I was trying to do differently in my biographer for Yale was to not do that, and to you have to make a case for why do we need the seventh biography of Marcus Aurelius or whatever. What's different? And I said, well, the thing is, we need to write one where it properly engages with Stoic philosophy and explains the role that played in his career as emperor. So I tried to do that to some extent, and at least in a kind of abbreviated form. I realized it would have to be a huge book because I'd have to explain the history and explain the philosophy. So it'd be like 1,000 pages long. So we tried to kind of give a condensed version of how these two things interact. There are over 100 references to the Meditations in my biography of Marcus Aurelius, for instance.
It's going to be such a good trilogy to give people like as an introduction to Stoicism, all three books.
Yeah, and they're going to disagree as well. Like some of the things I've said are maybe kind of controversial. But this is my interpretation of who he was. And as I've studied Marcus Aurelius more, I've written 3.5 books about him now. Because I wrote 3 books and I also edited an edition of the Meditations and wrote a preface, an introduction to it. And I've written some chapters for academic anthologies about Marcus Aurelius as well. The more I study him, the more sympathetic I become to him, really. It seems to me most of the things that people say that are critical of Marcus Aurelius, so on the internet, like you'll see people that say he persecuted Christians, he committed genocide against the Germanic tribes, he's to blame for appointing Commodus as his successor, where other previous emperors adopted the best man for the job or whatever. And all of these things I think are kind of really not entirely accurate historically. The truth is usually a lot more complex. And some of these things are that people say about him are just completely unfounded. They're just kind of based on like misunderstandings. I mean, for one, I think Marcus Aurelius, one of the reasons we have to ask, why did he face a civil war? Mm-hmm. So one thing we know about Marcus for sure is that a lot of Romans hated him. Like, not in the majority. He seems to have been very popular, but there were definitely a faction in the military and in the Senate, not just one guy, but like a bunch of guys, like who, I don't know, maybe didn't necessarily hate him, but really opposed him and wanted him to be removed from power, right? So we have to ask why. The only answer I can really think of, and the answer that's I think most supported by our historical sources, is that they thought Marcus Aurelius wasn't hawkish enough as a military commander. They wanted a more aggressive military policy, basically. And so this idea that Marcus was a kind of warmonger or whatever, I think is, apart from the fact that clashes with what he writes in private in the Meditations, I think it clashes with the history as well, because it looks like people really thought that he was placing too much emphasis on diplomacy and negotiation, and he should have been adopting a more aggressive, violent attitude towards the Germanic tribes in particular and the Sarmatians.
I can't imagine someone who's practicing Stoicism to have an outlook that is very violent and aggressive. Or is that accurate to say that? Or, because it's, yeah.
And he says in the Meditations, he'd have to be crazy, or he'd have to, really kind of hypocritical in a way. I mean, the true interpretation of this is a little bit more nuanced, but obviously in the Meditations, he says over and over and over again that what matters to him is a feeling of brotherhood, brotherly love, really. The Stoics call it philostorgia, by the way. This is one of the central principles of Stoicism, is this idea of brotherly love and the brotherhood of mankind, cosmopolitanism, the idea that we all are citizens of the same cosmos. So Marcus mentions Roman citizens, I think, like twice in the Meditations, but on every page, virtually, he mentions not being alienated from others, cultivating natural affection towards them, overcoming anger, exhibiting justice in his relationship with others, like all these interpersonal virtues, but they're all in reference to humanity as a whole, like not just to Roman citizens, which is remarkable if you think about it, because he's Roman emperor. And he's writing this while he's meeting Germanic and Sarmatian envoys every day. So he's talking about the guys that he's at war with, right? When he says, that he should cultivate natural affection towards the rest of mankind and view them as his kin. He means it, but he's still at war with them because they invaded his country. But he's not by any means. If there's any shred of truth in the Meditations, he's the opposite of a warmonger. He doesn't see these guys as the enemy or as other. He views them as his brothers and sisters.
Yeah, that's I think that one of the most inspiring things for me, at least reading the Meditations, is this perfect balance that I see between strength of character and compassion, because that's a really difficult thing to kind of balance. A lot of people are just too agreeable, too compassionate and pushovers, but you see this incredibly powerful, strong human being who's also going out of his way to practice tolerance and forgiveness and, kind of seeing how he relates to people.
He says something weird about that. He says that true manliness consists in the strength of character to exhibit kindness rather than aggression. And cut a long story short, people ridiculed Marcus Aurelius. Supposedly the general that instigated the civil war against him called him a philosophical old woman. And so they thought he was too soft. But Marcus responds to that and he says, no, angry people are weak people. Angry people think they're strong, but actually they're weak. And he says it's people that have mastered their anger and are able to exhibit compassion that are potentially the strongest characters. And that's what he aspires to be like. But this kind of understanding of Stoicism is rare in the modern world because the terms that we use in Greek philosophy generally became degraded over the past 2,000 years. And so when people say cynical today, they don't mean that someone followed the philosophy of Diogenes. They just mean that someone's sneering and negative about things. When someone says I'm an Epicurean, they just mean that they enjoy fine wine and food. They don't mean that they drink barley water and eat potted cheese like the ancient Epicureans did. Academic, sophist, skeptic, all these terms mean something slightly different now, something much cruder and more simplistic than what they originally meant. And so Stoic now means unemotional when we write it with a lowercase s. And in psychological research, it's commonly used as a term to denote toxic, maladaptive ways of emotional coping. There are large volumes of research showing that lowercase Stoicism, which involves suppressing emotions, is definitely not a good thing. Again, the weird thing is people who suppress their emotions believe that they're being strong, but they're more prone to mental illness. So they're actually very vulnerable, weak people as a result of this maladaptive coping strategy. Of course, they believe that they're strong. They're actually shown to be weak. It's a fragility, a weakness that it causes in us when we can't handle our emotions and we disguise them and we conceal them and we try to suppress them. But that's not what ancient Stoicism means. It's completely the opposite. In fact, ancient Stoicism is the inspiration for cognitive therapy, which there are huge volumes of research showing is good for us. So on the one hand, we've got this thing that's bad for mental health. On the other hand, we've got this thing that we know is good for mental health. And they're both kind of associated with Stoicism, but they're opposites. It reminds me of this quote from William Blake, the poet, who said, "We both read the Bible day and night, but you read black where I read white." So a lot of people misconstrue Stoicism and turn it into something that's almost the complete opposite. And part of that is that they completely ignore the reference to social virtue in ancient Stoicism. Stoicism was the inspiration to a large extent for early Christian ethics. So no one says that early Christianity was self-centered and non-emotional. It's a little bit brotherly love and forgiveness, obviously, right? Supposedly. And but that's all inherent. That part of it is all in Stoicism. It very much seems to be inherited. The Stoics use very similar language. The Stoics are in the New Testament. By the way, it's a bit of trivia for you. Not a lot of people know that. In the Acts of the Apostles, they're actually mentioned. St. Paul goes to Athens and he gives a speech a sermon at the Areopagus at the foot of the Acropolis, and it says that he was talking to Stoic and Epicurean philosophers there, and he actually quotes a Stoic author called Aratus to them, who was an ancient poet. He was a student of Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. So the early Christianity is steeped in Stoicism. The early church fathers, many of them had studied Stoicism. They refer to it. Even St. Paul, we're told in the New Testament, was talking to the Stoics and reading Stoic literature. But somehow people ended up thinking of Stoicism as this kind of unemotional Mr. Spock, cold-hearted, kind of atomistic, individualistic thing, and Christianity as being the complete opposite, weirdly. But these are caricatures. Like ancient Stoicism, as you know, particularly in Marcus Aurelius, in every single page of the Meditations, he talks about his cultivating a sense of brotherhood and affection and kindness and compassion towards other people.
Yeah, I mean, like I feel like I'm using Stoicism a lot, raising my 3-year-old, and I know firsthand experience that it makes me more compassionate. You know, like it's a tool that really helps me connect and show more love and be a better dad. Right? It's not like I'm cold and distant from my child. You know, so I'm seeing that every day.
100%. Like even Epictetus, who's a pretty tough guy, says that, you know, it's human nature. If you see a small child, you want to get down on all fours and play, like, and interact with them. It's natural to have affection for children, and like, you know, the Stoics really celebrated what they call the phrase in English is we use as natural affection, but actually in ancient Greek it kind of means paternal or familial affection, philostorgia. Like this is central to Stoic ethics. The Stoics think human nature is that we're designed to care about children, and they think we should cultivate that and extend it, and learn to care about humanity in general. They also thought the part of their theology is they think we should emulate Zeus. Like, we don't worship Zeus, but they did. And they thought the goal for them was to become more Zeus-like. And they said, well, Zeus is the god of hospitality and friendship, among other things in ancient Greece. And the Stoics took that aspect of them very seriously because they thought of Zeus as being the father of mankind. And they thought, well, Zeus has paternal affection for the whole of mankind. And so if you were to be godlike and Zeus-like, you'd also have to, you'd have this broad, encompassing perspective, like omniscience, but you'd also have this unconditional affection for the whole of creation, the whole of mankind. And so that kind of helps to define, in their eyes, what they think the ideal is for humanity.
Wow, that's beautiful. I was wondering if you could clear up an objection that I sometimes get when I'm speaking to people about like why I found Stoicism to be so useful. And it's usually an objection given to me by people that haven't, done that much research themselves, but maybe they are interested in like intuitive practices like breath work and meditation and yoga and things like that. And then I present, like the wisdom of the Stoics, and they will say, well, I don't believe that we should live a hyper rational life and we should be ruled by, the rational mind at all times. And, we need to leave some space for intuition. And I'm wondering, what is your thought about that objection?
I think the Stoics would say, yeah, but you have to, right, first of all, a couple of things. Like, first of all, I think the Stoics would basically say, yeah, but you need to make a decision about whether you trust your intuition or not. Like, and how do you decide whether you trust it? You have to use reason, right, to figure out, is your intuition, I don't know whether intuition is reliable or not. Some people's intuition's awful. Like, it's way off the mark. Like, so the Stoics would say, sure, you could incorporate and find a role for intuition, but ultimately you're going to have to use, the Stoics use divination, by the way. Like, but they would say, but you have to also use reason. They're not two mutually exclusive things. It's reason ultimately that becomes the arbiter of whether or not our intuitions are reliable. And all that it means is we observe the consequences of following our intuition, and we critically appraise it and decide, whether it's a good guide or not. Socrates followed his intuition. He had the daemonion, like his inner voice that he said would guide him. But he made a decision about whether it was usually reliable or not. Like he said, over the course of his life, he found it to be reliable. Like it was a good guide to life. You know, if it always led him into problems and it told him to do contradictory things, then reason would tell him that it's not a good idea to follow it. So I think the Stoics would find this a strange objection because they'd go, but you use reason and intuition, right? Like, but it's reason that tells us whether intuition is any good or not. As an aside to that, I guess as a therapist, what I would say is that, you know, you can't just say that intuition is a good guide. You'd need to say some forms of intuition are good, other forms of intuition are bad. Like sometimes intuition is reliable, sometimes it's unreliable. The intuition of someone who's clinically depressed, in my experience, is often a pretty bad guide to life. You know, maybe at some level it could be, but a lot of the intuitions that clinically depressed people have are depressed intuitions. Like the intuitions of someone who suffers from generalized anxiety disorder are usually that something catastrophic's about to happen. Like we're all going to die. Like those intuitions are usually wrong as well, right? Because they've got psychopathology, right? Maybe somewhere underneath that, there's other intuitions, I don't know, but certainly a lot of their intuitions are anxious intuitions or depressive intuitions. Why would that be? Because when we have anxiety or depression, we exhibit cognitive biases. So our brain goes into a different mode of functioning, and we become more susceptible to biased thinking. We engage in what we call threat monitoring in psychology. And I can't, there aren't many situations where I'd be working with a seriously depressed or anxious client. And I think, you know what you need to do, buddy? Just trust your intuition more. Like, I can't feel it. That, generally speaking, that's probably not going to be the best advice because most depressed clients would say, well, my intuition tells me I should stay in bed all day and never go outside. Like, and stuff like that. I'm like, no, well, yeah, that's probably just going to make you worse, right? So I, as a therapist, I'd say, of course, and we need to take a step back and decide, is this good or bad intuition?
Yeah. Wow. Love that response. I'm going to be stealing that, stealing that myself. So let's come back full circle. So when is the graphic novel coming out?
It's out on the 12th of July.
12th of July. And where can people find out more about your work? I know that you have some courses online that I know some friends have done and they've loved. So yeah, where can people find out more about your work and what you're doing?
I have a lot of stuff online. I have a lot of courses, a lot of articles. I've written like I think 100 articles or something on Medium. So if people go to my website, which is just donaldrobertson.name, there's like loads of resources and things that they can find on there. If they're really cheapskates and they don't want to buy a book, like, you know, which they could get from, by the way, I'm perfectly happy if they want to get my book from the library. Like, there's also tons of free stuff that I've put on, like huge, it would take a lifetime to wade through all of the courses and audio recordings and videos and things. So feel free to, you know, if your listeners or viewers are into Stoicism and they want a load of free resources. And also my website is donaldrobertson.name, and the Modern Stoicism organization, it's the non-profit that we founded. It's called modernstoicism.com. There's also, it has something like 500 free articles on Stoicism by dozens and dozens of different articles. It's different authors. Some of them are well-known academics and authors that have written them. So there's like so much free stuff online.
Wow, yeah. Your Medium articles have been a really good source for me kind of getting deeper into certain concepts that I get stuck on or just want clarification on things. And I just want to say, this kind of goes out both to you, but to listeners as well. But you have a chapter in How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. I think it's called The Story of Stoicism, something like that. And that chapter, I'd read a bunch of Stoicism books prior to reading this, but that chapter is my favorite chapter that explains Stoicism and the history of it in the shortest amount of time, but like in the clearest way. So I just tell people to read that chapter to get like this, like kind of, we can read it quickly, right? And you get the kind of download of what it's about.
That's because I had to explain it to my 6-year-old, like my little girl. And, you know, so I'd be telling her about Greek mythology and stuff. And she kind of got interested in Diogenes the Cynic and in Socrates. I would tell her stories about them. And so I had to kind of think, how do I explain this stuff so that, anyone could understand it, like a 6-year-old or 7-year-old kid could like get the basic. I think Socrates would definitely have said that he could explain philosophy to a small child. Like, I feel like that's pretty much part of his character, that he thinks philosophy is for everybody, right? Some of these ideas are relatively simple. So I think it was because I'd been trying to simplify things as much as I could, without betraying them or distorting them in any way. And sometimes it helps to tell stories and anecdotes. Like, that can be an easier way to get the ideas across and give some examples and things. But I think the graphic novel hopefully will also put a human face on Stoicism a bit, and allow people, maybe that were confused by some of the academic text to be able to visualize more what Stoicism would look like in practice.
Amazing. Well, thank you for the conversation. And so yeah, that was. I feel like that was like a really solid discussion about Verissimus. I have some kind of like just like Q&A based questions for you, just sort of like throw some questions at you that are kind of just feel free to answer these however you like, and maybe I'll release them as a self-contained answer, or I'll bundle a few answers in together with a few shorter episodes. Cool. Okay, so were the early Stoics Buddhist monks?
Some of them didn't wear shoes, and they kind of went about in robes and stuff. Some of maybe some Stoics shaved their heads. There's a little bit of kind of ambiguity in some of the actually Roman texts that, like, there's some indication that some Stoics might have shaved their hair. So I think could be like they looked a bit like Buddhist monks. Certainly the Cynics probably looked a bit like Buddhist monks. It's a weird and interesting and important question, because what's underlying it is some obscure areas of Greek and Roman history. I think a lot of people probably realize that Rome and the Mediterranean world evolved separately from the culture in India and East Asia to some extent. And people might not realize why that is, right? There's a very simple explanation for why it is. It's because Persia is in the middle. So the Persians controlled commerce for most of history, like between East and West. They controlled the Silk routes. And so they kind of wouldn't allow merchants easily to go for, or envoys to go from one country to the other. Nevertheless, of course, over the centuries, there was some contact between these cultures. Alexander the Great conquered Persia, and he took philosophers to the north of India. And so there was contact. And the Greeks even have a name for the holy men of India. They call them the gymnosophoi, which just means naked wise men, right? Mm-hmm. Here's a really deep dive, obscure bit of trivia. Marcus Aurelius had a Greek secretary who was a philosopher, a Platonist, and we're told that he traveled all around the Mediterranean, and he went to Egypt, and we're told that he spoke with gymnosophoi. Now, it's not clear whether that just means naked wise men that lived in North Africa, or it means Indian sages that had like traveled to Egypt or somewhere in Africa. So there's this kind of, again, slightly ambiguous hint that maybe someone close to Marcus Aurelius might have actually met. And the Greeks and Romans wouldn't distinguish between Hindu and Buddhist. Why? They're just Indian. Like, they're just naked wise men from the East. So it's possible Marcus had some limited contact with that culture, but certainly earlier Greek. There's one late source that says that Socrates spoke to an Indian merchant and engaged in philosophy with him. But the main connection is that Pyrrho of Elis, who's the founder of Greek skepticism, it's a philosophical tradition, travelled to India with Alexander the Great. He actually went there. And so some people believe that Greek skepticism is Buddhism in disguise. Not Stoicism, but this other Greek philosophical tradition that was a kind of rival of Stoicism may have been somehow affected by this these Hindu Buddhist teachings in India. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah. Yeah, perfect.
It's a hard one. We don't really know for sure, but there's definitely a couple of books that have been written about the possible connections between Eastern and Western philosophy in that regard.
What, if any, is the Stoic view on physical exercise? Did they think it was useful, important? What was the role of that?
They've got a surprising view on it. I guess it's hard to explain in a way, and sometimes people, for some reason, this annoys people. I think it's culturally, our view about exercise is in some ways quite different from the way it was perceived in the ancient world. So basically, their view, I think, is broadly similar to the view of Socrates and some other philosophers, which is that, exercise, first of all, plays a very different role in Greek and Roman culture. Obviously, most of them did far more exercise than we do today. So it was normal, for people to assess Roman citizens and for Athenian citizens to undergo kind of military cadet training where they would do martial arts like boxing and wrestling and pancration and stuff like that. But they also, and their athletic contests were bound up with their religious ceremonies in a way that seems kind of alien to us today. However, they also believe that people that over-exercise or become overly preoccupied with exercise. So I guess essentially their view is all things in moderation. Socrates, in Xenophon's Memorabilia Socrates, there's a really cool dialogue where Socrates is talking to a young philosopher who doesn't do any exercise. And so I guess a lot of modern people that are into exercise would love this dialogue because he basically says Socrates' arguments are often really simple. Sometimes we lose sight of that because they kind of seem convoluted, but the basic point is often incredibly simple. So he says to this guy, look, if you get a fever or you become really sick, does that affect your ability to concentrate? And the guy's like, well, yeah, obviously. And he's like, Socrates is like, so can you kind of reason and engage in debate? And he's like, well, no, because your thinking's all clouded and stuff. And Socrates says, so if you don't take care of your body, then that makes you poorer at reasoning, potentially. And the guy's like, well, yeah, I guess so. And so Socrates basically proves to this guy that if you're committed to the love of wisdom and following reason, then you have to take care of your body as well. Because clearly if poor health can impair your reasoning abilities. So the two things aren't completely separate. It's a really simple argument, right? But this guy's very bookish and he doesn't do exercise. And Socrates is like, this doesn't make any sense at all. Socrates used to dance. According to Xenophon, Socrates used to dance every morning for exercise on his own. And his friends used to laugh at him because he said he would wave his arms and legs around to exercise his whole body. I'd love to see that. Yeah. Apparently even the Athenians were like, this is ridiculous. But he did this he made up his own Tai Chi or something that he would do every day when he got out of bed. That's how crazy Socrates was. But he was a dancer and he believed in... Socrates was also a veteran of the Peloponnesian War. As an aside, my belief is that Socrates would have been the Athenian equivalent of a centurion. He seems to have been an NCO. He would liaise between infantrymen and the senior officers. He wasn't. I don't think he was really a regular soldier. He seems more knowledgeable and more experienced than that. So he's more of a military figure in some ways than people normally assume, as well as being, he was famous as a war hero, as well as being a philosopher. So he was kind of a physical guy in some regards, but he also ridicules athletes. He thinks they're too preoccupied with competitiveness. He has it's also a really cool argument about that in Xenophon, which infuriates people. And so Socrates meets an Olympic wrestler.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy's ecstatic because he's won at the Olympic Games, the ancient Olympics. And Socrates says to him, "Oh, that's really cool. Like, just out of curiosity, the guys that you beat, were they weaker than you or stronger than you?" And the guy's like, "Well, they were weaker than me, obviously. I proved that I was stronger than them." And Socrates is like, "Oh, cool. Like, so were they more skilled or less skilled than you?" And the guy's like, "Well, they were less skilled. Like, I'm much more skilled than them. Like, I proved that by beating them." Like, and Socrates is like, "Oh, like, so were they like more disciplined or like less disciplined in their training than you?" And he was like, "Well, clearly I'm more disciplined, right? Otherwise I wouldn't have beat them." And so Socrates says, "So well, what honor is there then, or glory, in beating people that are weaker, less skilled, and less disciplined than you?" Like,
wow.
And this guy's like, it's a sharp Socrates. Like, but I actually think that's a valid philosophical argument. Like most of the things that Socrates says, it's not like cut and dried, but it should at least make us kind of think. Especially, by the way, as an aside, that argument is much more pertinent today with all the scandals about drug use and other controversies that arise in competitive sport. Like this question, the philosophy of what does it mean to win a competition? Like Socrates is getting right to the heart of it and saying, look at, are we just discovering who was better all along or who had an advantage all along? And if we already knew that, then would it not be interesting at all? So are we just kind of celebrating ignorance in a way when we celebrate victory in a competition? Like, what does it really mean? Like, that's a really good question.
Yeah,
I don't know the
really
answer. But that's the Stoic attitude is they think in the ancient world, they do think that a lot of athletes are like, what we call them, like gym rats or whatever. And they also kind of caution against becoming so preoccupied, not just with exercise, but they think that their idea is that athletes are kind of egotistical in the ancient world, that they just want to beat people and they want the glory of winning competitions. And the Stoics and Socrates, I think that that's a kind of superficial, like, although we really celebrate it in our culture, they were a little bit wary of it because they think if you spend your whole life just like trying to win football matches or, like win at golf or something like that, is it really worthwhile at the end of it? You're just like, are those achievements worth celebrating? That like they think we should be cautious about investing too much importance in winning at competitive sport.
Yeah, that's got me thinking. I love it. If someone has already done a certain amount of work to kind of negate typical negative emotions, let's just say like melancholy, anxiety, things like this, maybe they feel like a sense of stability in their emotional life, but they would like to experience more joy and laughter and enthusiasm and wonder. Is there a place for this in Stoicism, and how might they access it using Stoicism?
Yeah, I think there's a way of reframing Stoicism that makes it a philosophy of love and joy. That would shock people. Like, I've said that before and people thought I was joking. I was like, no, like totally, I don't joke about things like this. Like, I'm deadly serious. It's got the word love in the name. Like, we call it philosophy. Like, it's more obvious if you speak Greek. Like, it means love of wisdom. Like, they're not joking. Like, and joy is bound up with love in their philosophy. Like, I think in the Greek it's more obvious actually. In the translation, somehow the way that we translate some of the terms kind of obscures the role that positive emotions play in Stoic philosophy a little bit. It gets a little bit lost in translation. But for sure, Marcus Aurelius has a systematic model of how to cultivate joy. Believe it or not, as Pierre Hadot points out in the Meditations, there's it's a highly structured text in some ways. Like, I remember talking to people in the past and they said Meditations is not systematic, it's just a bunch of random musings. No, it's like really structured and some, not in terms of the structure of the chapters, but he has this model in mind that Hadot talks a lot about, where he says there's kind of like a threefold or a fourfold classification that he uses over and over and over again. So the four cardinal virtues are these kind of three levels of relationship. So this goes back, I think, to the earliest Stoics like Zeno and Cleanthes and Chrysippus. They think we have a relationship with ourselves, we have a relationship with God or the cosmos as a whole. So the Stoics are pantheists, so those are the same thing, like God stroke the universe, like everything, like the totality of things we relate to. And then we also have a relationship with the rest of mankind. Like, so they thought of it in terms of these kind of like three levels. And Marcus Aurelius has a systematic model for cultivating joy. So he thinks we should find joy in our relationship with ourselves by focusing on and celebrating. He says the way to do that is we have to learn to cherish what's healthiest in our own character. So we have to change our values so that what we really celebrate and we really prize our own flourishing, basically. And then we create this kind of cybernetic loop or whatever, whereby, you know, the thing that we enjoy the most is the thing that's healthiest for us. Like, i.e., we have to celebrate virtue. Like, you know, because the Stoics believe virtue is our optimum state. Like, virtue is just the life of reason. It's just us reaching our potential. Like, so a man who really takes pride in achieving wisdom, like, and takes time to really contemplate that and praise himself for it, is going to be somebody that's kind of stays on the right path more in life. And we can take pleasure in that. We can get, I guess one of the main criticisms that Christians made of the Stoics was they thought that they indulged in pride because they didn't focus enough on the grace of God and salvation being due to God's kindness, generosity, grace, or whatever. They thought that we were responsible for our own salvation. But actually, most today, like we've come back round to that. Like, we place more emphasis on personal responsibility than the early Christians did, and so we're back kind of where the Stoics were. But the Stoics think if you take responsibility for your own well-being, that's the most important thing to you, then what does it mean to succeed? What does it mean to sense that you're making progress? You'd feel something, for want of a better word, you'd experience some kind of pride or satisfaction or self-respect or self-esteem or something like that, right? Like, you'd be looking at yourself going, this is what it's all about, buddy. Like, you know, I'm making some kind of progress here. I'm trying, I'm making an effort. Like, you know, I'm working on myself and I'm getting a little bit better every day. That's the main thing to me. Like, and therefore it's what gives me a sense of satisfaction when I look in the mirror each day. Like, I think I'm a better person than I was yesterday. So that's a source of joy for the Stoics. And they think that's the number one. That's the main thing. We have to recalibrate so that we're experiencing joy in our own self-improvement, basically. The second one is that how do we do this? We do it in part by modeling virtue that we perceive in other people. So we surround ourselves with the right people. Seneca, actually, I don't know if Seneca really said this, but it's often attributed to Seneca, this Latin saying, if you lay down with dogs, you'll get up with fleas. So the Stoics say, you know, you have to try and keep good company. Like, you know, seek out role models, people that you find inspirational in life and that you can learn from. So Marcus Aurelius does this in Book 1 of the Meditations. The whole of Book 1 of the Meditations is an exercise in joy. He literally describes that later in the book. He says, in order to gladden your heart, reflect on the virtues of others. He says that. He explains that's what he's doing. Book 1, you see him actually doing it. So this is an exercise in joy. He's rejoicing. He's thinking, what are the things that I really admire about my adoptive father? And he's training himself to take pleasure in contemplating the best in other people, because he thinks this is a healthy joy. Like, if you're the sort of person that really, you know, can genuinely, sincerely admire other people for their wisdom, then that's going to benefit you. Like, it's a very healthy philosophy of life to have. And so that's in terms of our relationship with others. In relationship with the cosmos as a whole, for the Stoics, it has to do with accepting our fate. And basically, Marcus talks about this in terms of training and gratitude. He says something, I think this is worth kind of explaining, because to me it's one of the most curious and profound things that he says. Marcus says that normally people imagine absent things as if they were present, and they desire them. So you think, I don't have a Ferrari, but it'd be really cool if I had one. And Marcus says this causes craving and pain. So you're imagining what it'd be like to have something you don't have, and it causes a sense of kind of longing or craving that's painful. And it's maladaptive as well, because you're responding to something imaginary rather than like responding to your real situation. It's not, and it causes you to devalue what you currently have. So it's a kind of unhealthy way of doing things. And he says if you do the opposite and you imagine present things as if they were absent, the emotion that you cultivate is gratitude. So this sounds ridiculous, right? But one of my favorite things is to imagine that I don't have a roof on my house. Like when it's snowing in Canada, and I'll think, geez, man, like a few hundred years ago, people were living in little shacks, reading the Bible by candlelight in Canada in the winter. What was that like? They must have been freezing, and I'm like, so look, we've got the internet now and microwave ovens and stuff. So to experience gratitude for simple things that you take for having a roof over your head, having double glazing and stuff, having any food at all, it's a much healthier attitude to adopt, Marcus thinks. So this is the joy that the healthy joy that we can potentially get from our material environment, from the fate that befalls us from the external universe. So there's ways of getting healthy joy from observing ourselves, from observing other people, and from observing external events. There's a whole system of joy in Stoicism.
Mm. Yeah, such a good answer. All right, so this one is partly like a personal one. So in my readings of the Stoics, I've seen a lot of amazing examples of reframing misfortune. I think Epictetus talks about, say you spilled something on the floor, this is a small price to pay for peace of mind. And I've become, I think, quite skilled at this way of kind of transmuting setbacks, obstacles, misfortune into, it could have been worse, and, finding the benefit, the silver lining in it. I'm just wondering, I sometimes wonder if this could ever go too far, where like every negative thing, I'm just like feeling okay about it, feeling good about it. And like, am I actually becoming blind to negative things? Or
Seneca talks about going even further than that. There's a bit in Seneca's a terrible role model, right? But I'm not saying this is what he was actually, but in the letters to Lucilius, at one point, he kind of makes out that when he gets really into attending lectures of philosophy, he says he comes out of them and he's wishing for misfortune, almost like he's kind of going, bring it on. Like, he's so kind of psyched with Stoicism. He's like, yeah, bring on some catastrophe so that I can deal with it, which seems a bit weird, right? But you can kind of if you read Stoic text and you get really into it, you can imagine. And these guys like attending lectures where they're you imagine if you were attending lectures by Epictetus, maybe you would walk out of it and think, yeah, bring it on. I hope I get played or something like that. Which is crazy. But Seneca talks like that at one point. I don't know. Could it go too far? I've never really seen it become a negative thing, to be honest. What you're talking about is similar to what we call in therapy decatastrophizing. It's like I haven't written it. This is my reminder on my arm. I don't know if you can see that. Tattoo.
Oh, right, yeah.
In Greek, it says, it's a very early Stoic quote. It says, "Uden de non peponthas," which is something that Crates, the Cynic philosopher, said to Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. It just means nothing terrible has happened to you. It's decatastrophizing.
Right.
Epictetus talks about one of his Stoic heroes, a guy called Agrippinus, who was a Stoic member of the Stoic opposition, like he says that this guy used to write letters to himself, like the Stoic letters of consolation, but he'd address them to himself, where he would eulogize. The word they use is eulogize. Like he would praise catastrophes. So if he was sent into exile, he'd be like, "Oh, this is a good opportunity to have a picnic in the countryside." Like, so he'd kind of turn everything into, he'd write a letter, like actually put in the hours, like put the effort, sit down and write a letter, kind of reframing situations to, as like, I'm not encouraging positive thinking, by the way. Positive thinking is like a dirty word now in modern psychotherapy, because we know like, what people often mean by positive thinking is kind of avoidant, or it's narcissistic. So generally it's an avoidant or an unhealthy strategy. There's a difference between positive thinking that's kind of Pollyannaism, like not being realistic, and spotting genuine opportunities in what seems at first like a misfortune. Someone loses their job, right? But they might think, yeah, but it gives me an opportunity to start my own business. That's not self-deception. Maybe that's true. Like, it's just another perspective on events, right? It's a valid, like, but a more constructive way of looking at the facts. And I think that's what the Stoics are describing. So I suppose the safeguard against it would be, yeah, it could go wrong if it lapsed into what therapists call Pollyannaism, which would be kind of positive thinking that's unrealistic or irrational. But if you can stay true to the facts of the situation, but find opportunity in them, then I've never actually seen that go wrong. Like, in 25 years of therapy field so far.
Great, I have more confidence now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, awesome. Do you think that there's a difference between someone who just knows a lot about Stoicism from someone who is a practicing Stoic, because, sometimes I've seen speakers and they studied Stoicism, they give a lecture on it, but then someone asks them, like, do you practice it? And they're like, oh, actually, no, not at all. What's going on there?
I think maybe I mentioned that when I first started, my first degree is in philosophy. And so when I first got into Stoicism, I was kind of reading books by academic philosophers. And gosh, this seems really weird to me now, right? Because the culture over the space of 20 years has completely changed in relation to Stoicism. So there was a time where it was mainly academic philosophers that wrote about it. And they would happily say that they just read the books and they never actually occurred to them to... I've spoken to professors, like senior academics, to say, it never occurred to me that anyone would try and actually put this into practice, which seems really weird, given that the Stoics go on and on and on about how you're supposed to put it into practice, and that, Epictetus in particular rants at his students about how they're not to be pen and paper philosophers, and that they should actually be living the philosophy, otherwise what's the point of it? So how is it that someone could spend a career studying this and then think, oh, I didn't think he meant that literally, or so? I don't know. It seems really weird. But now I think it's become fairly common for, like, most academics now, I think, actually realize that that's absurd. It's taken them 20 or 30 years. But they're now going, oh, there are loads of people that actually put this into practice. So it does seem a bit ridiculous to say that you would just read it and not do it. So sometimes people do still say that, but it's become less common. And yeah, like, on the one hand, everybody that's into Stoicism pretty much now is trying to put it into practice. On the other hand, I'm also kind of surprised. I think most people don't know how to put it into practice. So the Stoics have many psychological exercises and practices that they use. And so I see there are like thousands and thousands and thousands of people around the world trying to follow Stoicism. But if you ask most of them what they actually do, they're not really using the contemplative exercises or the techniques that much. which still kind of surprises me. I think that's it's kind of like they want to put it into practice, but they're still not really sure exactly how to do it. There's loads of resources explaining it. Stoic Week we run every year, and like 20,000 people or something, I think, have done that so far. And it tries to really guide people through and explain, like, this is stuff that you would do every day if you were a Stoic. You do the view from above and contemplate your own mortality. You ask yourself these questions, and like there's, like a bunch of specific things that Stoics would do to try and train their minds. I think that's the next stage in the evolution of Stoicism, is that people start to kind of really become a lot bit more kind of structured in the way that they put it into practice, and they're more aware of the actual exercises that they could be doing.
Yeah, for sure. I see that as something that is kind of missing myself, and that, like, I'm a constant like experimenter, and I'm always trying to kind of do things myself, and I'm definitely the type of person to like sit down and try and write like a routine and use your view from above meditation. But some people, they just have a few books and they kind of get stuck on it.
Marcus Aurelius says he does a view from above every day. And like, I thought about this a lot. Like, the first book I wrote in Stoicism, The Philosophy of CBT, I tried to list all the psychological techniques, and there are about 18, like, different, distinct psychological techniques that they describe repeatedly. There's like a whole toolbox of different techniques. But, I mean, that's too much, right? So the problem is there's too many. So I would say you could choose different ones to focus on. Like, I would say cognitive distancing, in a sense, is the most fundamental. But my experience has taught me that probably the view from above is the thing that people kind of find easiest to do on a regular basis. And I think, like, for most people who are like not really sure how to follow Stoicism more systematically, what it says, just maybe do the view from above every day, or like every few days, like, because that alone actually is going to help you make a lot more sense out of a lot of the other aspects of the philosophy. I mean, like, that's probably a kind of good enough starting place for the majority of people. It's fairly, I mean, you can even just listen to a recording, right? Or, pretty quickly, once you get the idea of it, you could just shut your eyes and think about the concept for a couple of minutes, like, every day. It gets actually much, much easier with a week or two of practice, like most of these psychological techniques. So I think that's kind of, maybe we've overcomplicated it for people by kind of giving them too many options. We should just say, just do that, buddy, like, just to kind of get started. Like, you can't go too far wrong.
Yeah. Are you familiar, I'm presuming you are, with the John Vervaeke video, View from Above, that he used your meditation as like the source for that?
I didn't know that. But I've met John Vervaeke, and he spoke at our conference in Toronto. He's a psychologist at the University of Toronto, and I did the View from Above kind of guided meditation at the is it the conference recording that you're talking about, or is it in another video?
He's got a video that is like titled The View from Above, so he's talking specifically about that, and then I think he links to your meditation.
Oh,
yeah, I'll link.
Watch.
Yeah, I think, if you haven't seen that, you can check it out.
He completely, like, he understands the psychological significance of it. I mean, it's a really weird thing. When I first started talking to therapists about Stoicism, the thing they were most interested in was the view from above. And I guess it's kind of hard to explain exactly why. But the only way I can put it very simply like this, that the view from above is really easy to do. And it clearly has a psychological effect. So psychologists love that, because they think, that there's got to be, it looks like the sort of thing that should have some kind of therapeutic effect. It looks like a no-brainer, to put it very crudely, that you should be able to do some kind of outcome study on this. Like, out of everything in Stoicism, you think, this is it. All we have to do is make a recording of this, get a bunch of people to listen to it, compare it to a control group. Like, this should be a piece of cake, like, to do an outcome study. So I think whenever you're talking to, like, CBT practitioners or psychologists, they immediately kind of get interested in it and their eyes light up. And also they're kind of thinking, how come we haven't already done research on this? Like, so I don't think it'll be that long before we see. There already are studies being done on it. It's funny because a lot of therapists and philosophers will say, like Freudians for ages used to say, "Oh, you can't research this stuff. It's too, like they'd be talking about Freudian analysis or Jungian analysis, and they'd be like, it's too subtle. It's too subtle. It can never be measured. It can never be quantified." It's like, good on you, but sometimes you kind of need to know whether something works or not. And some things are cool and philosophical and also stupidly easy to test. Like, the view from above is like a godsend to psychologists because they're like, clearly, if you visualize things from an elevated perspective and stuff like that, that's a learnable skill. And it clearly changes your perspective dramatically. So it's got to do something. I mean, either it's going to kill you or it's going to cure you, right? It's got to do something. So psychologists are like, it's one or the other. Like, let's start testing it and find out which it is. So it really appeals to them. I mean, luckily, like anecdotally, and from what little evidence we have, it looks like it's beneficial, like the Stoics thought it was. But, I guess almost more importantly, it's easily testable. So and weirdly, it's not part of CBT really. Like, there are some kind of indirect or like thing, but one of the things that surprised me when I was talking to therapists, they'd say, no, you're right. Like many of the things we do in Stoicism are identical to or very similar to things that we would do in broadly CBT based therapy. But there's not a common technique that we use in therapy that closely resembles a view from above. It's like a gap in the market. Like, there's an obvious gap there in terms of the repertoire of modern therapy. And all the therapists I know are like, how come we're not doing this? Like, it's definitely got to be worth a try. So I guess it's an exciting concept for psychologists and psychotherapists.
So final question for you. So if Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, the ancient Stoics were transported into the current era, if they were just to look at the kind of culture of modern Stoicism, not any particular author or work, but just the kind of the overall landscape of modern Stoicism, do you think there would be any things that they would kind of disagree with or think that people are doing well or would want to inject more of something else into it? Like, how do you think they would interpret it?
I think they'd want there to be more graphic novels.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't know. I've no idea. That would blow their minds, I think. They'd be like, what is this thing? I'm not sure what they would make of that. Although, weirdly, as an aside, one of our main historical sources for Marcus Aurelius is a thing called the Aurelian column, which is a huge column that has this circular frieze that spirals around it. And that's sequential art. It's like a precursor of modern graphics. So they are. Like, actually did kind of exist in Marcus Aurelius' time. They would look at us. That's a big question and a really interesting question. I think that there are a lot of things about modern society they would find kind of weird. I think they would think that we're very sheltered from our own sense of mortality. But it's hard to know what to pick on. There's so many things. But I think one of them is that they would probably say, you guys don't really live sheltered lives. Like, you don't really see people die. You don't look after your dying relatives. You're not seeing infant mortality like we did. You're not serving in the military like at close quarters like we did. You guys are really sheltered from anything that reminds you of your own mortality. And I think that in that respect, they would think that we were missing something, that we were naive in that regard. They thought their contemporaries were naive in terms of burying their head in the sand about their own mortality. They're going to think we are far worse in that respect, for the most part, I believe. They would also think that we're stupid, and they'd be right, because for a reason that's, this idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah.
Like that in some areas, people don't know how stupid they are or how little they know because they don't have the technical knowledge to be able to appraise their lack of knowledge. So like someone who doesn't know how to do basic arithmetic is not even going to understand when someone explains to them how they're getting sums wrong. Because they're like, I don't even understand the explanation. You know, like, I don't know how to do addition. Like, I'm just guessing the numbers. And someone tries to explain how they're getting these calculations wrong. Like, not even the explanation's going over my head. So they don't even know how little they know. And it's hard to explain to them sometimes. Like, so we know in modern society, compared to an educated Greek or Roman, where most of us are woefully ignorant and about rhetoric and logic, and like they would think we're kind of thick as two short bricks in that regard. Frankly, like they'd be like, "Do you guys not understand common informal fallacy? Like you guys keep on the." They'd look at us on the internet and they'd think, "You guys are making the same childlike errors of reasoning over and over again." Like, you know, they think our political debates are infantile. I mean, these things happened in their time, but educated people were more cognizant of what was going on. So, like ad hominem fallacies, overgeneralization, causal fallacies, modal fallacies, like, you know, they knew how to reason, like technically, in the same way that we know how to do a division and multiplication and stuff, that they knew how to use logic. And they look at like what we were doing and think, you guys are like, you don't even understand like how to think straight. Why? It's shocking. They'd have a field day with podcasts. Like, I think Marcus Aurelius, Joe Rogan did the podcast recently about how he loves Marcus Aurelius. I think if Marcus Aurelius watched Joe Rogan's podcast, it would make him weep. Like the level of stupidity on show and like, you know, crass ignorance and just like absurd, like illogical, like reasoning on display and constant head banging against the wall, abuse of the causal fallacy when talking about things like research and COVID vaccines. I mean, Marcus Aurelius doesn't even know anything about scientific life, but he'd understand the you know, the sort of shoddy reasoning that's on display immediately, I think. Like Epictetus, like ancient philosophers studied dialectic. They trained. Marcus spent decades training in rhetoric, and so when you train in rhetoric, you understand. You learn how to manipulate people, and rhetoric and logic are two sides of the same coin. So you when you learn logic, you learn how to spot logical fallacies, and when you learn rhetoric, you learn how to exploit logical fallacies. Like, you know, it's the two sides of the same thing, right? And Marcus had trained for decades with the leading thinkers of his era in logic and rhetoric. So these guys are way ahead of us. Like, in terms of, you know, it's funny because we normally think of progress in the sciences. Yeah. But, like, I mean, even if you're a philosophy graduate, you know, you do, like, you know, a few classes in logic and you employ Socratic method and philosophical reasoning kind of like for a few years in seminars and stuff like that. Nothing like the level at which ancient Greek and Roman philosophers were doing it on a daily basis for decades of their lives. They would wipe the floor with us easily in that regard. And they would watch Joe Rogan and they would watch CNN and Fox and all the other garbage that we consume and think that it was amazing that we've taken such a step backwards and we're now reasoning like, you know, we like idiots. Like they think we'd regressed compared to them and had become imbeciles. Like That's my honest opinion. I really, honestly, if Marcus Aurelius was here today, he'd look at the internet and think, how did we end up being so stupid? Like, how come these people can't spot, like, the use of sophistry? Like, has nobody taught them, like, how to spot overgeneralizations and arguments and black and white reasoning and, all these kind of things? The internet's full of people, like, using the ad hominem argument and stuff. Like, politicians do it all the time. Like, but Greeks and Romans would just laugh at that. Like, but we've regressed back into, like, being duped by it. So logic needs to come to our rescue. Like, that really is one of the main weaknesses in modern society. I think everyone's aware that political discourse is like a car crash, right? It's got a dumpster fire, right? On social media. I think it's fair to say. American political and Britain, most countries, maybe not everywhere in the world, but like political debate is farcical. I think like the ancient Greeks and Romans would have a lot to say about that. I mean, they had to deal with these things, but they understood what was going on around them. Like, they weren't as gullible as they think we're gullible by comparison. I'm sure of that.
Wow. Yeah, I feel both dumb, but also very inspired to go and start looking at logic and rhetoric. So, the basic thing, the starting point, I think, it's almost like logic, I think, is taught a little bit back to front. Like, we just need to learn about common fallacies. Like, most people actually start looking at philosophy, learn about things like the ad hominem fallacy. Yeah. So you see in debates, somebody will follow an argument and they'll go, well, that guy's a Nazi. Like, and you'll think, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't mean to say that the thing that he said, like, whether or not that's true, or nowadays it's like that politician's like a pedophilia or something like that, or like whatever. Like, so insults are thrown, accusations are thrown at people that detract from the content of what they're actually saying. Like, and people will reject an argument based on who said it, rather than whether or not the thing that they say is logical or there's evidence for it. Like, so that's the ad hominem fallacy, right? It's all over the internet, like on a like hour by hour basis. Like, so I think, just kind of spotting stuff like that is more important. Like by the way, medical, like any cognitive therapist, it's evidence-based practice. We're trained and we have to read research studies. Like, the media exploit a fallacy called the causal fallacy every day in reporting medical research, and like that they confuse correlation and causation. Like, it's their favorite thing to do over and over and over again. As an aside, I'd say to people, look up causal fallacies and look at the fallacy of confusing correlation and causation. It's fairly simple, and then you'll see like a lot of the health reporting, like the reporting of medical research, is garbage. Like, and it's just distorting and exploiting information in order to freak people out. It's a big problem for public health in our society. But I don't think the ancient Stoics would have understood that, because this is a problem more prominent in relation to modern scientific research. But it's a big problem in our society. Like, we're being fed not just misinformation, but like it's like these guys are saying 1 + 1 = 3 or something. Like, the stuff they're saying is just completely nonsensical, but it happens over and over and over. Joe Rogan has a career built out of doing this, pretty much. Like, he's not the only one. He's picking on him because he's the biggest one, right? But like, there's loads of other people. The media's full of it. Like, tabloid newspapers have been doing this for decades on a huge scale, but it's time that people became more educated about basic misinformation and health research. I think so. That's one of them. Like, that people should arm themselves with. The Stoics thought we have to study logic in order to defend ourselves against misinformation. Like, that was their argument for it. The Cynics didn't study logic. And then the Stoics' argument is, no, well, the thing is, if you don't study logic, then you're vulnerable, like, to people manipulating you with, like, rhetoric. Like, you'll fall prey to sophists then. Like, so at the very least, you need to understand enough to protect yourself.
That's really part of what ancient philosophy was about, but that aspect of it is kind of almost defunct now.
I love that frame. Logic is sort of psychological self-defense. That's it's a really powerful one. Yeah. Yeah, those are really epic answers. I appreciate those. Yeah, thank you so much for the time. We've been going 1 hour, 44 minutes. Yeah, and yeah, the way that you can just keep riffing off answers, and it's really impressive. So appreciate that.
My hobby.
Thank you. So
awesome.
I'll be in touch. Cool. All right, have a good rest of the day.
You too. Cheers then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Donald.